Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to you all. I see you're all still joining us. We have a record number of people, or 600, who have signed up so far. So good afternoon to all of you who've joined us for this webinar with Professor Albert Grundlingh, author of the just published biography of Van Zyl Slabbert, called Van Zyl Slabbert, Man on a Mission. Welcome also, especially to those members of Van Zyl's family who have also joined us today. Jane, welcome. Interestingly, I'll just show you a copy of the book. This is the cover. Gorgeous van in a suit striding towards you. It's available on at the Daily Maverick shop, and we'll put up those details a bit later on. It's a lovely cover. And now, Van Zyl Slabbert was one of the most intriguing and, I think, intellectually restless sort of academics, politician, and an intellectual who bestrode the South African political landscape through I would say, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And he shook white party politics in a way that few people in South Africa did at the time. And Van Zyl still features in contemporary South Africa. Just this month, Richard Calland raised the Van Zyl Slabbert report, which was a panel that he chaired on electoral reform, while giving testimony to the Zondo Commission about the lack of accountability in Parliament and how we can reconfigure the electoral system. So Van Zyl loomed large there. And then with the ruling in the Constitutional Court that the Electoral Act is unconstitutional, we are now all talking about new ways of practicing democracy in South Africa. So it's a very timeless book. And I think, Prof, you wanted to mention first how you came to this book, and then we're going to move on to, Van Zyl Slabbert's life itself and his beginnings and everything else. So tell us about your work on this project and why now.
Yes, it's actually a new departure for me, and it all started at Jane's farm at Pigs Peak. When we visited there in 2011, Jane contacted the university. The vice principal at the time, Arnold van Zyl, was contacted, and we went there to look at Slabbert's papers. We were very well received, and it was quite a revelation to go through his papers, at least superficially at the time. And I realized at the back of my mind, here was a good biography for somebody who's really interested in that. And interested in political history. I didn't think of myself as a possible candidate for that because most of my historical writing has been in terms of what I like to call social history. I worked on the so-called handsoppers and joiners during the Anglo-Boer War, on South African black people in the First World War, and then on rugby, which is another form of warfare, I can say, and South African rugby and Afrikaners, and the way in why the game had such an appeal for Afrikaners. In between that, a number of other things, and amongst others, dog racing in Johannesburg, the Voelvrou movement, kind of odd marginal topics, and I try to extrapolate from that to make some wider points. So I wasn't a natural candidate to write on Van Zyl. And then it dawned on me, but Van Zyl was also a different kind of Afrikaner, and those are the kind of people that had attracted me in the past. And the idea slowly matured, germinated. Initially, I thought I'll just try and write something on his academic life, because there's been quite a bit of writing on him as a politician. And then I really the bug got hold of me once I did his academic life. And I realized here was somebody quite extraordinary. And that's when I started working on it in a more sustained manner. And from there it developed. And since I'd retired, I had sufficient time to complete the manuscript. And to me, I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity to do that. It was a professional challenge. And I was also fortunate that I established a very good working relationships with Jane and Tanya and Rico as well. it enabled me to write more than just a political biography, to try and emphasize the personal side of things and the domestic life, the home life, and what he was like as a person, without their concern.
Let's kick off there, because I think what we spoke about in the green room was for me, very significant, is the kind of life that Van Zyl Slabbert as an Afrikaner was born into in those times, how different it was from that of the peers he would then, I suppose in a way almost miraculously, but because of his own personality, encounter at the highest echelons of Afrikaner society and academia and in politics. So take us through the milieu and Van's, his own description of his own existential description of how he came to be is also very funny in his own book. But take us into how does Van come to be a human being in South Africa at that time?
I don't think we can quite understand him. We don't go back a bit where he came from. That he came from a fractured family. He was always a kind of outsider, although he was very talented and a good rugby player. He did very well at school, him and Marcia. So that drew him into the charmed circle of teenagers. But he also stood apart. So at the same time, I was an insider and an outsider from a very young age. And he wasn't mollycoddled. He had to fend for himself. He was in a school hostel since the age of 10. So there were those sort of challenges for a young boy. And I think that kind of insider-outsider dimension stayed with him for the rest of his life. It is also that he, in Petersburg, as Polokwane was called at the time, he had a different kind of relationship with black people than many of his peers. And he also had a Christian conversion, a very profound one at the age of 16. And he himself admits that kind of conversion was actually a way of trying to establish linkages outside the family, spiritual linkages, to try and belong in a different way. And that I think is one of the keys to the book as well, that he always had this kind of mission, and that can be traced back to his conversion in Petersburg, and then his decision to come and study theology at Stellenbosch. That in a nutshell determined his trajectory.
But it was unusual for the child of two parents who were not married at that point as well, or one of twins. I mean, that would have been a huge scandal in those days. But other people stepped in as well. So Van was then, I think, held in some way by other extended members of the family, because the absence of father and mother too would place a child in the position of I need to survive.
He was taken in by his grandfather and his grandmother. And they looked after him, but although they had a good relationship with him, there was always this realization, it is not my true father and mother. He had a very good relationship with his mother, more so than with his father later on. But there was always this sense of not quite belonging. And I think that played a part. It's also when he came to Stellenbosch, he'd already experienced much. He wasn't the normal kind of middle-class Stellenbosch white student at the time. He came to Stellenbosch as I like to say, an old soul. He'd been through more than many of his other students. He worked as a youngster as well in Johannesburg, so he had some work experience. And he also went to Wits for a while to start off his studies, where he met Eddie Roux, who was involved in what was called the Rational Thinkers Forum, which was actually just a nom de plume for the communist faction at Wits. But he actually, and he also listened to Robert Sobukwe at the time. So those kind of exposures made him different from what was happening at Stellenbosch in the early 60s.
And so how does this different experience, including at Wits, affects then his academic career at Stellenbosch and the choices he makes around studying theology and looking for certainty there with a very inquiring mind.
The thing is, there are two things about Slabbert. The one is idealism, the other one is rationality. And I make the point that we're not always parceled out in equal measure. He came to Stellenbosch not only studying theology, but also wanting to play rugby, with Donnie Craven being here and Stellenbosch being the rugby university or the rugby factory of South Africa at the time. But one experience when they had to do missionary work at Langa, it was just after Sharpeville, they were chased from Langa, and the professor who went with them, he couldn't understand why they were chased away from Langa, because they then went there the reason why they went there was to convert people, to do good. Slabbert had second thoughts about that, and in his own mind, he started turning around the idea that there's a much deeper antagonism than is normally perceived at Stellenbosch. Stellenbosch is sufficiently secluded, was sufficiently secluded, still even to this point now, in a way, from the rest of South Africa. What happened in the past laws, in terms of the past laws, past Stellenbosch by, they were hardly exposed to black people as people of flesh and blood. It was all kind of intellectual concepts. But even on that level, Slabbert realized that is a problem, that you can't just exclude the human being from these laws that are being discussed every day and these grand apartheid schemes being floated. And he wanted to come to a rational conclusion, whether the system can work. That goes back to his PhD thesis as well, where he worked on Talcott Pass on structural functionalism. How can one test whether this theory will pan out the way it's anticipated? So the thesis was actually, in a nutshell, which is, by the way, I waded through it. It's very densely written, and I won't ever do that again. But the point Slabbert tried to establish was whether this could actually, whether it made sense, and how can one prove that it made sense, or how can one prove that it didn't make sense? So those are the kind of rational inquiries. But at the same time, the theology part was his idealism that came into play. And after the Langa experience, the idealism faded away in terms of religious beliefs. But he never quite got, those early pathways were well established. He never quite abandoned the need to be meaningful, to effect meaningful change in people's lives. He also insisted on, in classes, lecturing on grand ideas, not kind of trite kind of topics. He wanted to be there. How can one, where the actual debate is in terms of how the world functions?
Well, it seems then he takes this notion of contestation of ideas, and he's also influenced by many people in Stellenbosch as well, who are all thinking of this grand scenario the country finds itself in and where it might or might not go, and Stellenbosch is seen as the heart of that grand idea. Yeah. He then tell us about his slow entry into politics and his decision to enter white politics as an Afrikaner, rugby player, a man who could speak English really well as well, so we mustn't forget that. And we'll speak a bit later on. Interestingly enough, in your book, I've never seen so many reported descriptions of a man's physical appearance, not by yourself, but by others who surrounded him during the time of his political ascendancy. The English press salivated for him. He was always the blonde golden boy, the rugged, the Muhammad Ali of, So how does he take this inquiring mind into the white political realm at that point? And is there another option open to him already at that stage when he begins to want to engage with the system, in a sense?
Just as an aside, the English press, at the back of it, at times I got the impression there was almost an unexpressed or at the back of their minds. If only all Afrikaners can be like Van Zyl Slabbert, all our problems will be solved. Yeah. Yeah, that's just an aside. But it's still, I think one needs to be, in spite of what I said earlier, or just adding to that about what happened at Stellenbosch, because it was there were a number of intellectuals at Stellenbosch. I'm thinking of people like Johan Degenaar from philosophy, Andre de Tooy from politics or philosophy as well. We had a seminar group which was being run off campus. There was a campus which was very conservative, but outside of that, there were discussion groups, seminar groups, which seriously looked at apartheid and had serious discussions. It's sufficiently a small town where you could have these intimate but quite robust debates. So that helps Slabbert to sharpen his own thinking. So that was almost a precursor for his entry into politics. And the way he entered into politics, one of those precursors when he went to Soweto, when Piet Koornhof said at Stellenbosch that everybody in Soweto is happy with apartheid. Him and Jannie Gagiano went into, and that's another, well, harks back to Van Zyl's penchant for wanting to prove whether this was the case. So he went into Soweto. He met John Kwali, who was the editor of Sowetan and of the World at the time, and he questioned him whether this was the case. So John invited him for a meeting with fellow Sowetans, and they listened to him carefully, and then they were enraged that these two Stellenbosch people would come and parade Koornhof's ideas. But to Van Zyl, it was an experiment. He wanted to see how they react. But they took him seriously, and he said he almost thought at one point he should flee for his life. And then he led on that he was just trying to inquire about what the attitudes are. And from there on, that was a changing point for Slabbert, that what the government thinks is going on and what actually happens on the ground, those two things are world apart. And I think that was a spark that propelled him into formal politics.
I think we must also just perhaps contextualize the times for maybe younger people here who would wonder why would you not have any contact with opposing voices or the black majority, and that was the nature of the country at the time, where if there was dialogue, it was happening, in the liberation movements and elsewhere, but not within the white politics of the day, including the liberal politics. So that, I think it's quite interesting. There was, newspapers were used as propaganda. There were arrests, there were bannings, there was violence. These were not easy times. So it's interesting to just contextualize it there. So how does he then make his entry into politics? How does that happen? What's the decision he makes? He can't join the National Party. That's not going to happen.
Yeah, no. Although initially when he went to Stellenbosch or to Wits, he was a latent Nat, he said, but that's where it stopped. Typical Slabbert fashion, he attended a meeting in Johannesburg where he was asked, or the United Party. I don't think many people remember the United Party, but that was a very middle of the road, with emphasis on middle of the road party, and but slightly to the left of the Nats. He was asked to join them, and it was a very convivial evening. And Slabbert then decided, yes, he'll join and he'll stand as a candidate for them. But by the end of the night, he didn't actually sign the membership form. which caused a bit of a confusion amongst the Nats, amongst others, Horace van Rensburg, who couldn't find a piece of paper and was abhorred that we couldn't find it. In the meantime, Eglin got, who had Van Zyl in mind for quite a while already,
Just
got wind of this. And
explain to people who Eglin is, who Colin Eglin.
yeah, he was the leader of the PFP since 1971. And Eglin got hold of him and convinced him he should rather stand in for the PFP, who was to the left of the very small party at the time. I think it's something like 5 or 7 people to the left of the Nats to stand in Rondebosch. And Van Zyl was prepared to give it a go because he was under an impression that he would never really win Rondebosch, but it turned out to be different. He also had to give up his academic job. By that time, he was sick and tired of being an academic housekeeper, as he puts it, and he was ready for a new challenge.
Well, he moved from, I think, Joburg to the suburb where he was going to be, a candidate. And you've got some lovely photographs in the book of then how almost Van before South Africa. I mean, we're talking now about white politics, so people have to keep narrowing our orbit here. Where you have Van jogging, he's suddenly out jogging in Rondebosch, and Rondebosch is a very English-speaking area in Cape Town, a very liberal area in Cape Town. Van is very outgoing, charismatic. He's jogging, he's in the streets, he's meeting everybody, and of course, he unseated, I think, the candidate, and that's how he gets in is through Rondebosch. And I think that commitment there in the beginning to actually be in the constituency that is electing him. But that's a lovely read in the book about how Van comes to also understand the glare of the publicity, which he disliked.
There's one thing about Slabbert that's also crucial to his makeup, and it's the full immersion of what he does at that particular point. It doesn't necessarily imply that it'll carry on that way, but there's a full immersion and the full commitment. And that's often misunderstood, if I can just briefly elaborate on that, because he moved from one position to another. And that is seen that he got a 5-year attention span. I think that's misleading. I think he wanted to do too much at times, but it wasn't that he didn't put his whole heart and soul into what he was doing at that particular point. And if he then sees that it doesn't work out quite the way it should, then he may try other ways of doing it. The same way, and it goes back to structural functionalism. If this doesn't work, if this system, how does one test it? If it doesn't work, does it make any sense to carry on with something that's got shortcomings and where I can't make a difference? You wanted to make a difference, and he did make a difference in Rondebosch. And he was very active, yeah. He
was very active, but then he gets asked, because at that particular point, the politics in South Africa is very moribund. We have the National Party and these so-called oppositional parties in this sham democracy. But he gets asked by Eglin to write policy for the party on the future, and I suppose constitutionalism in a way. And that's quite interesting to look at the political options. He comes to the party with this, and he also finds Parliament quite boring and anti-intellectual as well, which, of course, he can't leave alone. Yes.
He changed the grammar of Parliament, and it wasn't sufficiently recognized at the time. It was the old Nat United Party rivalry, which wasn't about substantial issues. And Slabbert tried to inject a new, more intellectual argument into the fray, and to get him to talk about serious things like a new constitution, or the possibility of a new constitution. And he went to considerable lengths to try and work out a new constitution. Amongst other things, today it may sound strange, but there was a minority veto in it, but it was balanced by a Bill of Rights, and it was a universal franchise. Slabbert wasn't stuck on the franchise only. He wanted a range of other, what it's called nowadays, counterbalances or to make the constitution work. He was actually the first person, he was head of a commission who did that, and that is probably one of his most enduring legacies. His early involvement at a relatively young age in Parliament, he targeted the constitution. And still to this day, despite this country's many ills, it's still got a fully functioning constitution. Ironically enough, he was asked, as far as the voting system is concerned, by Maverick to look at the constitution in terms of possibility of having constituency-based participation. I just got the impression Maverick wasn't serious about this because the system worked perfectly for them. Why would they like to change it? But Van Zyl nevertheless did that.
Back at the time when he made these,
but it was just dismissed. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's a bit late. That's later on when he, leaves politics. But at this juncture in his career, it's very unusual to have a young Afrikaner voice saying to the party itself that it needs to that the constitution of South Africa needs to be worked on already back then. I just wanted to quote something that you have in the book, two things around the politics and liberalism of the time. I just want to go back there because Helen Suzman was also in the party at that time and known as one of the most outspoken and hardworking of the PFP reps. But you write that Slabbert broke, or you didn't write, but it was said in a paper unpublished that Slabbert broke the conceptual logjam of white party politics, and that couldn't have made him popular, but. And I suppose within the parties themselves, there must have been a discussion about where does liberalism fit in defiance or in opposition to apartheid, and then later on in a post-apartheid South Africa. So that's quite interesting to me as well, that he then veers towards liberalism as the only, I suppose, option at the time.
Yeah, I think Slabbert had his own reservations about what one can call sort of true blue liberalism. That you can't just transport a system which originated elsewhere and apply it holus bolus to South Africa. You had to make some adjustments, but without jettisoning the core concepts of liberalism. There was something which was floated at the time, it was called Slabbert's liberalism, which had an African inflection where we thought that Africans would buy into that notion to the same extent that he did. He had his reservations, what he called the kind of haughty, sneering liberalism, was always a kind of automatic right away. He was angling for something more indigenous, more in tune with the needs of South Africa than what the true blue kind of progs advocated.
Well, you've got a passage, I just wanted to read it, where he says that liberal politics, there were these assumptions, cultural superiority about liberalism with its haughty sneer of those accustomed to having automatic right of way, and that had to be interrogated. And interestingly enough, I think that that form of liberalism still remains in South Africa, and we might just move this on to the DA later on, but that's not about Slabbert himself. I want to ask you a few questions. I feel those of you who are watching have asked, and there's some that came in earlier and some here now. If you want to maybe address those, and then we can move on to Slabbert's later, his leaving of Parliament, because one of the questions is about the work that Slabbert tries to do within the white political system, within the liberal tradition, and then he has to make a decision for himself whether he wants to remain there and, in a sense, expose the Parliament for what it is in resigning. So somebody asks that, was it a strategic mistake for Van Zyl Slabbert to resign at that time when he did resign from the PFP? And how long was he a parliamentarian as well?
He was 12 years at that point in '86. It was Slabbert's resignation caused quite a furore. He was seen as a major figure, and he had such a kind of formal and informal following. that it came as a shock that he should resign. It was actually seen as an abandoning Parliament altogether. Where will that leave South Africa? The leader of the opposition, which got that kind of following, has got no faith in Parliament. But one has got to look at that in terms of the long view of where Slabbert came from. He entered politics somewhat reluctantly, but then he was fully immersed in it. But he always he had some kind of an inkling that he'd still like to go back to academia. But what really got to him was the fact that there was no change which he could identify with happening through Parliament. The tricameral Parliament, which was a setback to him as he supported a no vote for the tricameral constitution, and that just bogged down the whole process of real change. And he lost support amongst some of the English press and some financial support as well. So, and then in particular, when he went to see P.W. Botha, initially the meeting went quite well, but then P.W. taped it, and it appeared from the looks of it that it was quite a congenial encounter. But at one point, P.W. said, I don't see any real need for change, because that was in 86, and after the states of emergency in 85. P.W. said that I believe that I got the support of most black people in South Africa. Immediately, that Slabbert said, well, he thought in his own mind, I think, that goes back to Koornhof, where Koornhof thought that black people just loved what the Nats did. And yeah, he got the same kind of argument. He went to Chris Yennes, who was Minister of Constitutional Development, and it also seemed to go well. But then Yennes said, Slabbert, if you keep on arguing against the racial ordering of society, then we will shoot. We won't keep that up. And at that point, Slabbert realized, particularly after the meeting with PW, that what is going to change? Nothing is really going to change. On top of this as well, we had the situation where he was sidelined by the military. He was led astray about what was happening in terms of the Nkomati Accord, where there were transgressions of that accord, but that was blithely denied by Magnus Milan in Parliament. And he was just sick and tired of being kept for a fool. And he was seen as a good guy to have around, and almost as a kind of person that we can show we allow these liberal ideas to be floated in Parliament, but they will have no effect. We'll carry on as before. And I think all those things combined, along with internal party squabbling, which always happens, he thought, well, I had enough of this. I can't make any progress here. This system doesn't work for me.
He then, I'm sure he had to consider his options as he came to these decisions. He would make a decision quickly, often people would think, but he must have considered his options. And so what does he decide to do? Because, he leaves without a constituency, without a party, in a country that at that point, appears to be heading for a bloodbath somewhere. But, there's stuff now, in retrospect, we know that is happening. But at the time, really no prospects anyway, unless you joined the ANC or the underground, or who knows,
I wondered about that, and I couldn't find really a convincing answer. I had to come to the conclusion that he wanted to leave. What will happen afterwards, he wasn't too sure about that. He had no formally worked out plan. He had the plans later developed, but in February 86, when he left, when he resigned from Parliament, I don't think he had an explicit plan. He didn't even have an alternative job lined up. And him and Alex Borain, who left a week after, he'd have thought, well, perhaps they must just leave politics altogether and start making some money. So there was that kind of hiatus, which was prevalent in his own thinking at the time.
But then he does something which is very, very important and which is still celebrated today. He begins to find his own way of opening up a channel of discussion with the ANC and involving Afrikaners, because I think it's quite interesting that that becomes the focus of his vision at that point, is to bring Afrikaners somewhere into the middle ground and start a process of moving this from the outside, which is quite visionary at that moment. If you could just talk us through that period of Van Zyl and Borain's life.
Yeah, that was in 87, as after it started at BIDASA, which was a non-governmental organization, trying to bring different sections of South Africa together to talk to each other and to find out exactly where they stood. Because in a way, Slabbert thought the lack of communication was responsible for much of the unrest. Not that talking will solve anything, but at least it'll be a starting point. And it's then that because he had met Maverick and some other members of the ANC earlier in '85 in Lusaka, he felt that he was very upbeat after that meeting, and he felt that the ANC has just been misrepresented in South Africa, and if there can be wider support for talking to them, it may just break the logjam. It's then when this Dakar Conference was organized, and very much a cloak and dagger affair. And many of those people who went there were Afrikaners or Afrikaans speaking. They weren't nationalist people, but they were Afrikaners who felt that the good name of the Afrikaners were besmirched by people like P.W. Botha. So they were on the left, as it were. The meeting proceeded affably and convivially at times. I gave some very, what I call, what can be called thick descriptions, detailed descriptions about what happened in Dakar, and it was almost like we now love each other and we're going to take this further. We can now resolve matters. Slabbert still had his reservations, and he wasn't that convinced that things will now proceed smoothly, but at least a start has been made. There was a huge furore when the Dakarites came back to South Africa, and the AWB wanted to attack them. There was an outcry in the newspapers about talking to the enemy, those kind of sort of over-the-top reports about Dakar. Now, the question probably then is, often Dakar has been referred to as a key moment. I got some reservations whether it was a key moment in the long term, because at the same time, unbeknown to the Dakarites, the government also has some initiatives about approaching the ANC. And the major difference then is the government had the power. Slabbert's grouping had no power. A lot of goodwill, but no power. The government had the power, but not that much goodwill at the time. Mm-hmm. So eventually the people with the power won out. So one can say that psychologically the props of South African society has been loosened through Dakar. But when the break came eventually, it was much more to do with government initiatives than Dakar as such. Although they did prepare the ground in a way, it wasn't the crucial dimension.
Well, so much so that once de Klerk makes his announcement in 1990, and as you say, unbeknownst to the Dakarites, the government is finding a way of talking to Mandela and the ANC. But once this, the decision is made by the apartheid government to release Nelson Mandela and other political prisoners and begin some sort of road to reconciliation, negotiation, and a new constitution, it's as if the contribution that Van has made, and we kind of have to skip over it here because we've only got an hour, because the depth of the pushing of the boundaries of thought in South Africa, it was a slow incremental process in a way, and Van is very vital in pushing us there. But he then finds himself in a kind of a no man's land. And one of the questions somebody has asked is, was a man of integrity let down by Mbeki? That's one of the questions. And somebody else also says, why did he abandon politics after the ANC took power? So I suppose those two questions converge and ask the same question. If you could, I mean, what happens then?
Yeah, the thing about Slabbert was that from the 1990s onwards, he wasn't prepared to be usurped by either the ANC and far less than that. He still wanted to maintain a certain distance, but what happened between Mbeki and Slabbert was at Dakar, they got on like a house on fire, and it was Slabbert who said that after this friendship has been established, that he's prepared to die for that bugger, that is Mbeki. And when Mbeki came back to South Africa, he assisted him with housing, and initially it was quite the kind of warmth of that relationship was maintained. But as Mbeki rose through the ranks, the distance grew between Slabbert and Mbeki. We've also got to bear in mind that Slabbert was very gregarious and expected people to behave in a similar kind of manner, and he was full of goodwill, and whilst Mbeki was much more clinically and inclined, and particularly when he became vice president, he didn't need Slabbert any longer. Slabbert has served his purpose, and Slabbert was led to believe that he had to join a local branch of the ANC and work his way up through the ranks to play a part in the ANC. And of course, you don't do that to somebody of Slabbert's stature. So that's where the fault lines appeared. He also had kind of a better relationship with Mandela, but he also had his reservations about Mandela. So Slabbert wouldn't have easily become a pliant ANC member, particularly with Mbeki's disastrous AIDS policy. It's impossible to think that he would have served in the same cabinet with somebody who's got such preposterous ideas.
What was his relationship like with Mandela? What was it genuine? Was it curiosity for the two of them?
Well, he thought that Mandela was very good on the public relations front. He was less competent in terms of government appointments, about policy, about the nuts and bolts of running a country. Broadly, those were his reservations.
There's a question here from John Weaven. He's saying, why didn't Slabbert help write the Constitution of South Africa? That's the question there. Well, I suppose he did, but almost not at the table, maybe.
Yeah, just two things. I mean, just to get back to, I'll get to that question now, but just to make the point that I think it's also a misconception that Slabbert left politics altogether. He was involved in with the Witwatersrand Metropolitan Chamber for about 3 years, and he really enjoyed the job because that was hands-on politics to get people to pay for electricity, amongst other things, in Soweto. It was running local politics and local affairs. About the Constitution, Slabbert was always, he foregrounded the Constitution. I think that was amongst the other reasons why he was chosen by Mbeki to investigate how a new constitution should presumably function in South Africa with more constitutionally based electoral concerns foremost. So that didn't work out. It was just shelved. It wasn't taken seriously. And Slabbert felt he was completely abused. He was led astray. One commentator said that Mbeki led Slabbert up the garden path, but perhaps Slabbert allowed himself to be led up the garden path. So those were the kind of issues that played a part. There was an attempt to to bring the two together shortly before Slabbert died, but that never materialized.
Well, I think, if you, a man like Slabbert, as you said earlier, seems to sort of want to have genuine friendships with people. And as you say, I think Mbeki was just expedient at that moment. And Van Zyl came with no apparent political cachet.
That's a very good point. Yeah, you know, constituency, what could he add? I mean, politically,
so who wants your brain? We don't mind,
Yeah.
The question that was asked then, I think, we've answered that question now. There's another question that came in earlier about, do you feel that Van made his mark or left the legacy that he may have hoped for South Africa?
Slabbert, in later life, well, it was about late 60s, he made a remark that he was a failed politician. I think he underestimated his contribution. But he was a disappointed person in at that period, when he turned when his late 60s. He felt he didn't contribute as much as he could have. He felt he wasn't as recognized perhaps as he should have been, although he was never a glory hunter. But the point I want to make is that he didn't conduct politics in the ordinary way in which politicians do it, through parliament, etc., also through the extra parliamentary ranks. He had a higher sense of politics, of making South Africa a better place. He always had a metaphysical streak in him, and a philosophical understanding of what politics should be. And I think in just making people think differently on various issues, not necessarily harnessing it to formal political positions. He was far better doing that. And that's harder to pin down, but one must make that point, than if he had formal positions in politics. I think he was so much more of a catalyst than he ever realized himself.
Yes, I agree with you. I think that, but that once again, one mustn't forget the times and I wouldn't say this at academic level, but in political level, it was an intellectual wasteland. And to have someone be articulate in ways that included one's sense of place and self, other than the way the apartheid government saw it, was very valuable. We can't measure that. There's a question here from Rob Davies saying, it's not about Van Zyl, but why have the DA been unable to have another leader of his stature? Well, difficult question to answer. He was a once-off, I suppose.
Yeah, Slabbert, when he left Parliament and he was accused of abandoning ship, and there was no immediate apparent leader to succeed him, and he was blamed for doing that. He said if the DA couldn't have produced another leader in the time that he was there, in the time that he was in charge of the DA, then there's something wrong with the DA, not with him. Then the problem is with the party, not necessarily with Slabbert himself.
Absolutely.
Because they were becoming dependent on him. He was this charismatic, sort of 7-day wonder, charismatic person. So, and he wanted to get rid of the idea of the Great White Hope, which dominated personal cult politics.
Which he despised in many ways. Can you talk to us a little bit about his relationship with Helen Suzman? Of course, a stalwart and someone who was relentless, and her feelings about him, perhaps, and the argument they have had about his leaving the PFP.
Yeah, initially they had very good relationship. He had a huge respect for her. She'd been in Parliament for 13 years when he got into Parliament. And she was a mentor in some ways. But when he left Parliament, that soured the whole relationship. And Helen Suzman was furious about it. And he felt a bit guilty, but he also thought that he had to take his own decisions. And for quite a few years, there was some bad blood between them. But eventually that also, I won't say they kissed and made up, but they got along much better later on. And there was Helen actually warned him against the ANC in the early 1990s and told them, "You'll be disappointed by the ANC," which turned out to be the case.
I think what's interesting, if you look at those early attempts to engage with the ANC, one also must not forget, even though Van Zyl Slabbert was an academic and an intellectual and moving in the political realm, is that there was very little understanding in South Africa of the machinations and how the ANC actually worked. We might have known the names of the key persons, Oliver Tambo, Thabo Mbeki, but there was absolutely, and that you could see this later then in the constitutional negotiations when the ANC brings its own team and they deal with Roof. I think there was a complete lack of understanding of the capacity of the ANC or what its goals were, or its ethos. It was. Would you agree with that, or
yeah, one does get the impression, and I think that's probably one of the sad things, that Slabbert wasn't involved in the CODESA negotiations because he had no constituency and he wasn't called in, etc. Because Slabbert, despite his respect for the ANC, he was very much aware of their political manipulations as well. So he could have played a more crucial role, I think. But of course, that is just being speculative now. He didn't, so but he could have. He had the ability to do this, and the competencies and the understanding and the political news to have done that, but that then didn't happen.
Yeah. I'm just going to show people a cover of the book again. It's Albert Frederik's book on Van Zyl Slabbert, A Man on a Mission. You can get it from the Daily Maverick shop. I think there'll be details for you to click, and also know that the webinar will be put up on our website later on, and you can watch it again. And I see there's another question that's come in, which is very interesting, from Veronica Bouting from Pretoria. She says, what would Frederik van Zyl Slabbert have made of our country with its gross corruption and dysfunctional politics and economy, plus our unenviable reputation as the most unequal society in the world? Are you able to perhaps gauge?
Yeah, that's Slabbert, of course, would have been abhorred in the way in which things developed. That was not what he could have. He had an inkling that something like that may happen, but he never thought that it'll be systemic the way it has transpired. He met the ANC in exile, and he realized that there was a sense in which a lack of accountability as far as finances are concerned. And I think some of that has come to fruition in the way in South Africa, which couldn't have been foreseen at the time. Some of it, but not the extent of it. But Slabbert had the inkling that the ANC wasn't above board as far as financial matters are concerned. It was, as he put it, it was far too easy to pummel Norwegian and Nordic countries' consciences for money. It was far too easy to get money and without being held accountable. He was aware of that at the time. So, but he never, as I said, the extent of it was beyond his imagination.
And I think, today as we look back, and we're in a week where, the former president of the country has, the court is, the commission has asked for him to be arrested. It's quite unfathomable if we think about where we are at the moment and what we didn't, wat ons misgekyk het. Sorry, I can't say it in English, and that perhaps, thinkers like Van Zyl, political environments tend to be anti-intellectual, and political parties tend to be anti-intellectual. And the ambitious people today in parties seem to want to just have positions and power. It seems a bit sad that we don't, I'm sure there are many young people, I think, politicians in politics today who are thinkers and pushers. But Van Zyl himself was a unique apparition at a moment in time, and your book does him, I think, enormous justice. It's a wonderful read. We were speaking earlier on that you are an academic, and often academics don't make an easy transition to writing biographies, but yours is comprehensive. It's lovely. As I said to you, I fell in love with him in a weird way. I mean, I was very young when it was around.
You're not the only woman.
I believe so. Luckily, I can do no damage at this point. Slabbert's own deterioration towards the end, is that partially the unfulfilled mission of the little boy who had to survive on his own and had so many dreams and hopes, and just at the end thought,
I think he had medical problems at the time, and I think that contributed significantly to spells of melancholy. He was unable to exercise. He was always a very active person. And I think one can't discard the medical condition and think blithely that it was because of his so-called lack of political achievement. There was an underlying medical condition.
And I think also just his existential inclination towards melancholia as well. He's a questioning person. Who am I? You know, Van Zyl wanted to be something outside of the physical form that he came in, in the unrelenting world. So, Albert, I need to sort of close off. Let me see if there's any more questions. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes before we go. There are a lot of viewers here, 406 of them. Perhaps I just should leave to you some closing remarks that you might want to make about what you hope we achieve with this lovely account of this man's contribution and life.
I think I was fortunate being able to try and do this biography. Few historians get those opportunities, and it was professionally, I really benefited from attempting this work.
I think also, it will contribute to perhaps a wider discussion outside of the book about opposition politics in South Africa today, because in many ways the concerns that Van Zyl Slabbert had when he was a parliamentarian about the level of debate and what opposition should do and its role is still something we need to talk through, and for that reason also an important piece of the puzzle in the way forward.
One can extrapolate from his life and try to put those building blocks in place that can be traced back to Slabbert. I think that'll be a very useful kind of pathway to explore.
Yes. And also, let's not forget that Stellenbosch University has an institute, the Frederik van Zyl Slabbert Institute, which I think is continuing the legacy in terms of intellectual inquiry, restlessness, and to not ever find yourself, stagnant in one place. So he's still there, and it would be interesting to see who he was now. But Albert, yes, thank you very much once again to all of you who've come. The book is available at the Daily Maverick shop. And I'm sure we will see much more, I think, in the coming weeks and months as we try and re-engage with electoral reform, what it means, what Slabbert brought to it, and are we able to find a more democratic way of electing our leadership. And Van Zyl's thought has contributed to that. So thank you very much, Albert, for your book and your time this afternoon, and everybody who has attended, and to the Daily Maverick. And your publisher is Jonathan Ball. So thanks to everyone for their contribution.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I appreciate the interview. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, Prof. Bye-bye, everybody.